Housing market has taken a major turn. Like everything else, at the grocery store, at the gas station, at the mall, housing prices are soaring too. Mortgage rates are way up. Goodbye, American dream. Buying a house is now feeling less an attainable goal and more a distant fantasy.
The media is talking about over-the-top market housing crashes, but is that what's really happening? Today with me, Leonard Steinberg. Billion-dollar real estate luxury broker, decades of experience, one of the best in the business, to talk about New York City real estate. And I'm here to talk a little about Connecticut and Greenwich, Connecticut real estate. Together, between the two of us, let's see if we can get some answers. What do you think?
Sounds good to me.
Any news channel that you turn on seems to be the biggest story is real estate. Housing market crashes, inventory at an all-time low, interest rates exploding, inflation. But when you start to talk to local brokers, like I know in the Greenwich market, we are seeing an increase of inventory, but we're also still at all-time lows. It's still very much a seller's market. We're still very much healthy. New York City and Greenwich and Connecticut have always had an amazing relationship. You know, you yourself becoming and being a Greenwich resident as well, building a house. What's it really like in the trends and what's happening in New York City in real estate? What's it actually going on?
Well, I think you mentioned something that's most important in that real estate is hyper-localized.
Yes.
And if you ask me what's happening in New York City, I would have to answer which building, which block,
right,
which buyer,
yes,
which seller, which market, which time of year, because every market is so hyper-localized as to be different from not just building to building or block to block or neighborhood to neighborhood, but literally from apartment next to apartment.
Right.
And I think that is the biggest mistake people make, is they try and focus on averages.
Right.
And I've seen so many averages thrown out recently, enough to make me want to throw up.
Absolutely. I mean, the same thing. It's for a couple of years now, we've been looking at real estate across the country under one general microscope. Everybody's doing well. All the properties are going up in value. Everything's increasing. But the way it used to be was very much location, 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 hot spots, cold spots, knowing what's happening in the market. So when we're talking about New York City and we're talking about the market, and you're saying specific buildings, specific boroughs, specific things. So let's talk a little bit about the trends that you're seeing. What's hot, what's not, what's happening?
Well, I think trends evolve and shift and change as markets mature. I think there was a tremendous rush in 2021 to make up for lost time in 2020 and 2019. And so you had this enormous amount of buyer buildup and demand buildup, and that started to eat away inventory, mostly with people trying to expand because they wanted more space.
Right.
There was an enormous renewed demand for
right,
outdoor space. Not that people wanting outdoor space is anything new, by the way.
Yeah.
Everyone's dream apartment is, or dream home has outdoor space. Whether you can afford it or not, that's the difference. But I think those were the two biggest trends: space and outdoor space. More space, outdoor space. Then I think what happens after these rushes and this build-up, pent-up demand on certain things, then you get back to what is known as normal. And normal is everything, and it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
What someone might want in the way of a smaller, simplified life, someone else might want the exact opposite of a much larger, bigger life. And there is always going to be death, divorce, marriage, new fortunes, lost fortunes, family creation, kids moving to college. It's called life. Real estate is a reflection of life.
Yeah.
It is not a reflection of a news headline.
Right.
And unfortunately, we live in a media headline-obsessed world where scandal for profit is very, very tempting these days, where everyone is fighting for eyeballs. So the more salacious and scandalous the headline, the more attention you're going to get. But averages are a consumer's worst enemy.
Mm-hmm. So most people who are going to watch this are going to be trying to learn about real estate and watch it and understand the market. They're going to want to know, okay, so on one hand, you have statistics that we're looking at, seeing high inflation, high interest rates. We do have a large amount of people that are backing out of deals. We are seeing inventory still build, but it is still very much a seller's market in our market, and probably the same in New York City. But for the actual buyer and seller, should the seller in New York City who's selling an apartment with you, should they start to be worried about maybe not getting as many offers as they used to have, or maybe it's been on now for 2 weeks. What's going on? I haven't set a record price. I need to be lowering my price. What can you tell them about what's happening?
Well, I would say my parents also used to tell me this, yeah. When I've bought you 12 toys in 2 weeks, you're a spoiled, selfish little brat. And then the next week when I don't buy you any toys, you get very upset. I think the same is true for what we're experiencing in 2022. When you come off this mad rush and you have seen a level of sales volume and moves and price rises, the likes of which you haven't seen in decades, of course, everything after that feels very different. And what is happening right now is an acclimatization to a new normal. And maybe the word normal is the word to use after seeing abnormal. So instead of comparing everything to 2021 and maybe the beginning of 2022, maybe it's time to look back to 2019. And if you look at the figures in New York City and if you look at the figures in Greenwich and compare them to 2019, they're actually pretty solid.
Yep.
And maybe they're pretty sane. So sane and solid with a better balance between supply and demand can be healthy for everyone. I would also say the rhetoric around high interest rates is a fallacy because 6% is not a high interest rate. It's a much higher interest rate than an extremely low interest rate. And yes, it has gone up very quickly. And I think that's a bit of a shock to the system. And whenever there's a shock to the system, there's a bit of a pause and a moment and time that takes to heal and acclimatize to that new normal.
Right. So, and something we're seeing is, yes, it's interest rates in the sixes. The Fed's talking about raising the rates again, which I think they're continuing to put water on trying to slow down the money supply. But we're seeing a ton of jumbos because that's what we really are. So our rates are still actually in the fives, which anything prior to 2008 was, anything under 5 prior to 2008 just was unheard of. We just got so used to it over time. Are you seeing those interest rates now in the current market that you have, where the interest rates have risen, not affect the high end in New York City as much as far as apartments and residential sales because a lot of them are still cash, and cash is still a great place to put into real estate as a hedge on inflation?
Well, I think the biggest problem you see in the mortgage market is how uneducated most people are around mortgage options. And I think at the higher end, you have a lot of people who are very much more attuned to finance.
Yeah.
And because of that, they understand the multiple options they have to finance. Whereas the media, I think, has done an awful job failing to educate the consumer as to the wide variety of options that do exist for financing. And if you think about the average homeowner spends between 7 and 13 years in a home. So the concept of focusing exclusively on a 30-year amortizing mortgage seems like insanity, right?
Yeah.
Why would the focus be that? For some people, it's absolutely the right product, and for others, it's not. The other thing I would say is we shouldn't underestimate the impact rising house prices have on inflation when it's 40% of CPI.
Right.
So with that in mind, the Fed obviously wants to cool the housing market, and let's face it, it's working.
Right.
So this is working, and then what happens is you have a cooling of markets, you have a cooling of an economy. Hopefully you also have a cooling of inflation, which more than likely leads to a slowdown in the economy, at which point usually that's when the Fed starts lowering rates again, at which point you can refinance if rates come down. I don't think we're going to go to the super low rates that we had in 2020, 21 again for a long time.
7, 30-year fixes.
Yeah, and who stays in their home for 30 years?
Right.
But let's go back to the core ingredients of home ownership. Why do you buy a home? The fallacy, again, that I think the media and too many people have portrayed is around this 30-year mortgage. You're going to own a home for 30 years. Well, in reality, everyone on this planet, for the most part, if you're living to an average age of around 79 years old, needs a home for close to 60 years.
Right.
So why are we talking about 30 years?
Right.
Do you want to rent for 60 years
Right.
and send a check to a landlord that more than likely is going to escalate at a 1 to 2% inflation rate, these days a lot more? Over time, you're talking about $1 million+ even at the lowest end of pricing. Right. So I think we need to start becoming much more educated, not just fiscally, but specifically to the costs that are very relevant in the big picture of our budgeting. And one of those, the biggest costs is housing. But I think the wealthier market does have an advantage in that they're very, very financially aware.
So when we advise buyers and sellers, specifically buyers in this point that I'm talking about, we look at the fundamentals, right? This is not exactly a recession, which is 2 negative GDP quarters in a row creates the recession, which technically we kind of are in. But if you look at the fundamentals, banks are not doing what they did in 2008. A lot of these buyers today have made, these banks and these lending institutions have made sure that these buyers are credible buyers that have put a good amount down so that they can live in any sort of decrease in property value through any sort of recession or housing issue. Plus, it's still the same fundamental that I tell buyers. Depending on what you're going to buy this lifestyle product for, usually depends on, it also says how long you're going to be into it and living in it, and then you'll be able to outlive any sort of cycle that we're talking about. And at the end of the day, are you caring more about what you're putting down as far as cash and large amount, or do you care more about what your monthly payment is? Because the interest rates could increase, or they could stay, or they could go backwards. But really at the end of the day, is this the product you want to live in and raise a family? Because that's totally different than the transitional, I'm buying a property as an investment and looking at that. Long-term hedge on investment for a buyer, putting, let's say, all cash down on a property, it's still a great hedge on investment and inflation. Long-term asset, it will go up. It could produce income for you down the road. Those fundamentals are still solid. So that's what I've been telling buyers. Have you told buyers, hey, this is kind of a crazy, we should pump the brakes? Or are you still giving that same advice, the fundamental advice of, if this is what you're going to be, if this is where you're going to be living and you're going to be living for some time, it's still a great time to buy and you're going to be in it for a certain amount of time. Don't try to be in it for a year and leave.
Well, I think the most dangerous thing all investors do is trying to time markets.
Yeah.
Timing markets is deadly, but in all markets there's opportunity. I do, however, believe too many consumers, and not necessarily my clients, but the consumer out there at large is often views the real estate agent as someone who merely facilitates a transaction. That is probably one of the biggest mistakes the consumer makes, and maybe one of the biggest mistakes agents make in not communicating to the consumer that an agent is not just there to facilitate transactions. An agent is there as a trusted real estate advisor to formulate a series of options for the consumer, identify what the options are, and then strategize or create a strategy curated or customized specific to their need. And everyone's need and timing is different. If someone told me today they want to buy a $10 million home for 2 years, I'd tell them they're insane.
Right.
You have to rent.
Yeah.
But I do believe that one of the biggest mistakes some of my wealthier clients make is putting their life on hold to potentially save some money when they will never get those years back. That's number one, because I've seen families who eventually did buy something because they put everything on hold, and then when the market came back and they felt more comfortable buying, they had fewer options, they had less opportunity to negotiate, and worse than that, they'd lost 2 to 3 years of life that they could have enjoyed in their home, and it wasn't really that much of a gain, if anything at all.
Right.
So I think time is the last luxury, and if you have the luxury of capital, access to capital, then you are in a different position. I think if you're very stressed capital-wise, that's different.
Yeah.
And I think if this is a recession or becomes a recession, it's a very unusual one.
Totally.
It has been triggered by all sorts of unusual forces, and the high level of employment is very unusual. I would also say that the average worker's wage has not kept up with inflation. But if you look at higher salaried and income people, CEOs, their income has soared well beyond inflation.
Yeah.
So I think every individual's circumstance is different. And you as an agent have a responsibility to understand fully the picture and then identify the options and opportunities and then formulate a strategy.
The New York City, Lower Fairfield County market has always been synonymous together. You have New York City, you have Hamptons, which is like, what do they call that? The Hamptons is like New York City South, or something. I don't remember, New York City with a beach. But New York City and Greenwich, Fairfield County, Metro North has always been synonymous. Do you see a slowdown in the future? What do you see happening in the future as far as everybody wanted to be in New York City, and then with COVID, a lot of people wanted to come out and get that house and change their lifestyle and work from home. Do you see, if the market slows down, people starting to go back to the city, or do you see this healthy connection still happening?
Well, I think the biggest mistakes people make in real estate is when they react. There's only one way to make smart moves in real estate, and that is to act with purpose and a method behind your madness.
Sure.
So I think people who reacted and said, oh my God, the city's going to melt down, I've got to get out of the city, I'm running. I think some of those people may regret it and decide it was the wrong move and move back. I have, however, heard from the vast majority of people who did make a move because they said, we've been thinking about this for some time and this triggered us to make the move. They're thrilled.
Yeah.
They're loving the life. And I think a whole new wave of people who never thought they would enjoy Greenwich or Fairfield or other parts that are outside of the city are discovering that they're loving it. As importantly, these areas are creating amenities in their towns that give a flavor of city life with all the benefits of out-of-city life.
Right.
Also, I think the value of being 45 minutes to an hour away from everything you missed in the city makes you experience the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's going to go away. And I do think the transition of people moving from city to suburb and suburb to city is a rotation that'll keep going on forever, because its appeal in both directions is forever in my books.
And while one group loses population, they figure out a way to get it back, and then the other, and there's always going to be, the grass is always greener.
It's a rotation, and it's evolutionary, and you see it happening all the time. I do, however, believe that all real estate, both in the city and in the suburbs, has to evolve with the shifting needs and tastes of the consumer.
Right.
And when it does, it'll always have an audience.
Put your advisor hat on as a real estate agent. You're listing a property in the city, and because it will most likely be the same kind of advice I might give to somebody here. The house has been on, or the unit's been on. They priced it the way they would normally have priced it in this market. It's been sitting now for 30 or 60 days. Abnormal. And they're coming to you saying, what's going on? Is the advice start to turn into, this market is shifting a little bit, we have to get used to it, and you go back to the advice, like you said, of your spoiled brat kind of thing? And do you pull the trigger quick, or to say, maybe we need to do a price adjustment here, or do we stay the course?
Well, I think it's very important to understand who the spoiled brat in the conversation is.
Yeah, that's a good
because
point.
I do think a lot of agents have forgotten just how long real estate used to take to sell prior to 2020 and 2021.
Good
and
point.
then you get acclimatized to a new drug called easy, quick sales. Although nothing is easy and quick, because I will say to any agent who has had to navigate multiple bidding and the stresses and the anxiety and the anger and the frustration and the sadness that goes around that, it's just a new set of problems.
Yes.
But I don't think agents especially have a very long memory. So I think we have to remember 2018, 2019, where things didn't take 30 and 60 days to sell, or certainly not 3 or 5 days.
A year to 2 years, a couple of years.
Exactly. So I think the key is to look at the markets for what they are. And whenever you take full, accurate inventory that's honest, you will always find real solutions. And if you can see long-term trending, that's a downward trend, and you don't adjust to it sooner rather than later, you'll pay the price later.
Yeah.
Pay the price sooner, you might be ahead of the market. But I think one has to be very careful to overreact or react. Yeah. I think it's always smarter to evaluate things calmly, methodically, factually, and fully understand the data and have complete data, because the data you might find on a website or Googleable is not the complete data. You know, and I know data that no one else knows, because we see what's transacting before it even transacts. So having that knowledge and then applying it specifically to where you are to understand long-term trending, that is a smart thing to do, applied to the specific desires of the client. Because one client might be in a hurry to sell and they don't care, and another one might have all the time in the world. So I think you have to curate a specific plan, an action plan, to the client's need, to the market, to the specific property, to the competition, to the supply and the demand. And ultimately, every market is dictated by supply and demand. And by the way, there are some times where there is no market. There's just no market.
Yes.
So why go to market?
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
Then you don't go to market.
Yeah. But I think you said it, and I did a video on what it actually means to be the best agent or a good agent. And so many agents call themselves the best agent. And
Everyone's the best agent.
And we say, well, what makes you the best? Are you going off of volume or network or market understanding or marketing expertise or what exactly it is? And I think there's so many agents that got into this real estate business and have no idea what it's like about price adjustments, no idea how to actually read inventory. They just got very good at booking showings and dealing with that, which can be sometimes difficult. But really being able to consult, especially a high-end buyer or seller, and be an expert in giving them the best advice is something that sometimes takes years and dedication and work and studying. And that's something that kind of got lost because everybody expected to sell for the most amount of money, and it was easy. And everybody expected to buy and just have to put in high prices. So there's new listing agents getting new buyer agents taking buyers out. And no, it has to be at ask or over, even if it doesn't have to be. You just,
Well, you know what? You always find the layman's indicators to a market where you have to wonder, where's this going now? So when the cab driver tells me, buy Bitcoin, and it's 60,000, then you go like, maybe that's a bit high. And when the cab driver says to you, I'm buying real estate, you go like, maybe real estate is a little overheated right now.
Bubble.
And when the cab driver tells you all sorts of things, you can learn tremendous things from cab drivers, because when trends become so mainstream as to become fashionable, and where everyone is just making money so easily, that's a red flag moment.
Got it.
And that is a moment also where things turn, and when things turn, you separate the professionals from the amateurs.
Right.
And some people are professional from day one, and some people are amateurs in their 50th year of doing it.
Sure.
But I think the word best is a 4-letter word, if I'm not mistaken. One has to be careful. And I think to be best, you have to have a variety of skills that go well beyond merely just the transaction.
Right.
And that's where I think things get lost, because some people are outstanding at facilitating transactions and hopeless at other things. And some people are good at the other, and then there are a few who are good at both. But the greatest agents, I don't believe, are necessarily the ones who sell the most, although I do think that is an extraordinary skill that needs to be celebrated, because I do think volume is impressive. The one agent today that is going to become most valuable to the consumer is the agent who can deliver non-Googleable insights. Because where everything is, I also think, by the way, everyone's like, well, there's just so much information out there. And it's like, well, load up more information, because you try navigate that.
Right.
And I do think a professional agent has the capacity to edit and extrapolate the data and insight that is meaningful to their client.
Real estate has always been said to lead us into recessions, and has always been able to pull us out of recessions. One of the biggest indicators that we're kind of looking at right now is the unemployment. And unemployment levels are still pretty low. As inflation is really high, they watch unemployment, because if that gets really high, we got big problems. With that being said, the builder community also watches these stats, and the building community and giving us supply is a big part of leading us in and taking us out of recessions. We're seeing a lot of people pull out of new developments. The supply chain is not great. We're trying to work on that with Canada right now in lumber and things like that for the residential side. But what are you seeing as far as new construction, building, current leases or current contracts out that people are pulling out of that for new constructions?
Well, to get out of a new construction contract is very difficult. And in the city specifically, if you pull out of a new construction contract, you're going to leave behind probably 20%, not 10% anymore.
Right.
But I do think, again, layman's indicators, when everyone goes out and says, I'm going to build a home and flip a home because I can make a lot of money, then you have to wonder, is that getting overheated?
Right.
But I do think we're in a very different time, because regardless of what happens in the economy, regardless of what happens in the housing markets, one thing we are certain of is that we have a tremendous undersupply of housing.
Yeah.
Not in all price points, though. It's especially acute in the affordable housing sector. And what happens in a recession, or in the threat of a recession, or even just in a moment of fear, people will say, I don't want to commit to a home, I'd rather rent. So now you're seeing rental prices soar on an astronomical level.
Yeah.
And it pains me to watch this, because the opportunity to buy versus rent does exist for a vast majority of people who are renting right now and who are going to pay even more for rent, and just will never get into the value add compound interest cycle of home ownership. That is the big one, is that the investment of a home is way beyond just 4 walls and a house. It is an investment that simultaneously caters to an essential need. Everyone needs a home. In fact, it's the only thing I think that all 8 billion of us have in common. We need a home.
Right.
So if you need a home, and you can buy a home, and you can avoid rising rents, that to me is a tremendous value add. But I don't think that once this economy turns, and it always does, we will go back into a cycle and go like, oh, we have so much excessive housing. In fact, we might even have a worse scenario as home builders pull back.
Why would home builders pull back?
Because home builders are always subject to timing and the cost of finance. And let's face it, you had, I think, over 1 million skilled workers leave the industry in the 2008-2009 recession that didn't come back. So you have shortages of labor, you have shortages of land, it's complicated to build, it takes time to build, and the risks are very high. So some people might say
Cost
like,
of product.
yeah, so let's wait and see what happens. But we are already in a commodities deflationary moment, a massive deflation.
Yeah, things are coming
If you
back.
look at the copper price, if you look at wood, I mean, lumber, copper, steel, everything, those prices are down sharply. But not unlike housing prices, where everyone's comparing everything to these crazy highs. You have to start looking at what is a sane normal.
Right.
They're still elevated, but they're sharply down. And my concern is that in this moment, which may last a few months or a year or two, who knows how this adjustment takes, and I'm not calling it a shift. I'm calling this the rebalancing of markets, because I think shifts are different. This is a market that is reacting to extremes. And whenever there are extremes, there's a hangover. And I mean, think Studio 54. At one point, the FBI raids the place because it's just out of control. you know, and then you know what happens? 6 weeks later, it reopens and it's a little more calm. And I think that's what's happening in the market. You're having a rebalancing. But I'm worried because at the end of this cycle, will there be enough housing? And my feeling is there's going to be even less housing. I think there's going to be an even greater imbalance between supply and demand, with 130 million millennials and Gen Zers much closer to home buying age. And then what happens to home pricing? It may get even crazier.
Rentals. Rental market has exploded. I did a video the other day where they charted the cost of home ownership versus the cost of renting. And it was more expensive leading all the way up to 2008, where it was more expensive to own. And then when the housing market fell off, boom, it was more expensive to rent than it was to own. Then it creeped up, went down, creeped up. The spike we are at now of how much it costs to own a home with these rates going up is not gradual. This is straight up. The rebound could be straight down.
It will be. It has to adjust.
And that means that these rents are going to explode. So in New York City, which there's a lot of rentals in New York City, that's a big part of the economy. What happens in New York City as these rents explode? 10, 20, 30, 40%? What happens?
What happens is what happened in the housing purchase market in 2020 to 2021. It'll surge and then it'll rebalance. What we will see in the rental market is a rebalancing is coming, because some of the prices I'm seeing are irrational. And whenever something becomes irrational, you can be certain it has to adjust and correct.
Right.
And it will come. So whoever is making, and I know many clients of mine are making an absolute fortune with new leases they've sent out, because let's face it, the landlord's always laughing loudest.
Yeah.
But I also tell them, enjoy this moment, it's a bonus. Don't forget, though, that in 2020, all those landlords that are laughing now were crying because they had to slash their rents, they had to do free months, etc., etc., etc. So I would always say, whoever wants to evaluate anything related to housing, don't look in 1, 2, and 3-year increments. Look at 10, 20, and 30-year increments. That's when you see the real picture.
Yeah.
In a year in real estate is a short moment.
Yeah. So in New York City, we kind of talked about this before we started recording. If it gets so much that affordability for first-time home buyers is just, the interest rate's too high, I don't have the money to pay cash, this is unaffordable for me, let's look at the rental market. The rental market is either A, completely unaffordable, or B, just such a low inventory. What happens? Does a third party come in and start to put an answer to that? Say, we talked about the rental caps and stuff that they were putting on there.
Well, I warn landlords on a daily basis. I say, if you love these rising rents, be wary of greed, because greed sooner or later gets everyone with the pitchforks to come out. And when the crowds come out with the pitchforks and say, we can't do it, then what happens is government steps in. And when government steps in, that's messy. So there are rent control laws already in effect in New York and in other big cities around the country. And it worries me that when you do not cater to affordability, that becomes more and more of the focus, which is not what it should be. There's only one way to bring down the cost of housing, whether it's rentals or buying. Build lots. That's the only way you can bring it down. Because at the end of the day, everything, whether it's a rental or whether it's a home that you buy, it's about supply and demand. That's the way it goes. If you go to the vegetable stand today and there are 5,000 apples for sale, they'll be priced a certain way. Yeah. If there are 5 apples for sale, they'll be priced a lot higher.
Right, exactly. Right now, the Greenwich market, like I see it, and the lower Fairfield County market, yes, inventory is creeping up, but the market is still super healthy and it's still good. New York City market, super healthy, super good?
No, I would say normal. It feels more normalized, but I would also say you had a equity market shift, a quite notable shift, where you have some of the best companies in the world, with their stock prices down 30, 40%. It's almost irrational. That, combined with the Ukraine war, with an energy crisis and soaring energy costs, soaring inflation, hesitation around housing, a lot of factors, and then you add in a wealthy audience that hits July and wants to disappear on vacation.
Right.
So a lot of factors all combining at once for no way in a few weeks to gauge a long-term perspective of what's happening in the markets, but we already can see people coming back from vacation and heading back into the markets. But I wouldn't say this is a 2021-22 market anymore. This is the second half of 2022, and it's a new market, and it's probably more aligned with 2019, and it seems more sane and rational, but only time will tell where it's heading. I do think at the end of the day, areas like New York City that did not see the mad rush of pricing that places like Boise, Idaho, and maybe some places in Florida saw.
Right.
When things soar too far, too fast, they have to pull back at some point to reality. In Manhattan and New York City and Brooklyn, they didn't soar that far. Rentals, though, I think seem out of whack.
Yeah.
That seems a bit nuts. Then again, if you look at the average price of rentals, what does that mean when someone's renting a $28,000 a month apartment and someone's renting a $5,000? Are you averaging those?
Yeah.
Who gains any value from that? The key, though, is we as a capitalist society have to build more affordable housing. And I'll tell you why it's essential. Because the most capitalist country on the planet is Monaco. And they build affordable housing. Why? Because your teachers and your firefighters and your restaurant workers need to live somewhere. And if they have to commute 3 hours a day, they're not going to show up. Or they're going to want extraordinary salaries. So if the most expensive building in Monte Carlo can have an affordable housing component, so can every part of the world, because that's capitalism at its peak. It's not socialism. It's called practical.
So why doesn't it happen here more?
Because we aren't practical. Let's just get practical. If we got practical, if we ran our societies and our politics and our government the way we run our own lives, we'd have much better results, because you and I, in our day-to-day lifestyle and operation and business, are practical. The word practical has to come to that arena for us to find real solutions.
So I think that the market that we're living in here in the suburban Lower Fairfield County housing market is healthy. I do think it will be healthy. I think it will normalize and to become like what a normal market would be.
Right? What is normal? You know, no one knows what normal is, but
we forgot what it was like.
Yes.
Yeah, 2018, 2019. I thought was getting. I thought that was normal, and we would. I remember back then being like, this is not a bad housing market. When you start in 14, 15, and there's 88 months of inventory. I remember touring and showing properties and talking to sellers. Yeah, 88, 90 months of inventory, 2.5 years on the market, and I would come in with an amazing listing and pricing strategy, and I would have to do more, and I was doing a lot more to find buyers and list and market properties than a lot of other people, which was attractive because it was kind of a new energy and a new way to do it. And I think now that still stands firm, but I think it had been so much easier for people. And now it's going to go to a little bit of like having to be good at what you do again.
You have to be good at what you do, also be a bit more patient.
Yeah.
And normal is the circumstance you're in.
Yeah.
You cannot say normal is that, because it's almost meaningless. Normal is the circumstance you're in. When you look at a lady in Ukraine pushing a cart with her groceries, surrounded by war-torn buildings, and you go, this lady's just moving on with life. That's her new normal.
Yeah.
6 months ago, she was walking her groceries through a beautiful neighborhood. We adapt very quickly to our circumstances, and we forget very easily what happened 12 months ago.
Yeah. So a seller who comes to me and says, Mike, is it a good time to sell my property? I would still say in my area that it is a very good time to sell your property, because you're still going to be selling for an increased value than prior years. But I would just let you know that we are having a little bit of an increase in inventory. Same thing in your market?
Absolutely. I think also what I always ask a seller and says, Leonard, is this a good time to sell? My question to them is, it's not that simple an answer.
Yeah.
I can't say yes or no. My question to you is, what do you want to do once you've sold? What is the plan? Because if the plan is to downsize because they don't want to manage a huge house, you want to manage it for another 5 years until this magic market shows up? What do you want to do with your life?
I think
or if you need more space, are you going to contain yourself in this tiny little space and suffer for the next 5 years until the perfect time comes?
Yeah.
I would also, though, say that in a market that is rebalancing and maybe there's more room for negotiation, if you are selling a $3 million property and you have to do a 10% discount of $300,000, but you're buying a $5 million property where the discount is $500,000, you're doing very well.
It's all
relative. The key is, what is the big picture?
Right.
So it's not just about the transaction, it's about what is your plan?
Right. So you said something else. I still want to go on this topic. I don't want to lose it, but you said something before about time. So timing was
Time is the last luxury.
Time is the last luxury. And I think that when we're talking to sellers about, should I sell now, should I buy now? The second question, just like you said, should be, well, what's the plan?
How many years do you have left? I always ask myself that, the other day I was driving and I was like, look at those beautiful magnolia blooms.
Yep.
And I was with someone in the car and said, you may only see 20 more seasons of those. And I was like, 20 years, that's it?
Yeah.
But in reality, we live to an average age of about 79 to 80 years. How many years do you have with your kids? How many years do you have in retirement? How many years do you have at college, et cetera, et cetera? You have to put it into a global perspective to understand that your home is just merely a canvas for your life. It shouldn't be the driving force that dictates everything about your existence.
Right.
But it is something that can deliver extraordinary satisfaction, can fuel your life, can bring exceptional enjoyment, and then at the point of selling, more than likely you will be a beneficiary of the time and energy you put in to paying down the cost of it.
Yeah.
I see so many old people that sell, and one of their primary investments and savings is their home.
You know what's so interesting about you and what you're doing? I just thought about this was when people ask, is now a good time to sell or now a good time to buy, and how's the market? Those are very logical, analytical questions, not emotional. I just give me dollars, cents, what's the price, and blah, blah, blah. when you start breaking it down, that's not that simple. It depends on where you are, what's your plan, what you want to do, and you start using things like what do you want your life to be times the last luxury. You start talking about things, they start thinking about their life. Because once you start thinking about the lifestyle of a real estate property and your home and your life and your loved ones and how you're going to use that asset, things definitely start to change in the conversation about monthly payments, down payments. So you're saying, I'm selling something right now, I'm going to take that money because it's going towards this. That's where I think it's so important that being really good and being one of the best at what you do is able to break that down for people.
You do. You have to actually understand the mission at hand. Because when someone says, I want to sell, it's like, do you want to cash out and make a lot of money? How much do you pay for this property? How much did you put into the property? Where are you going to live? You have to live somewhere. Where are you going to live? I live in a tent because I made all this money. No, you won't.
Yeah. Right.
So where are you going to live?
Right, exactly.
I do think, though, that that's the biggest problem we have in life right now is everyone wants to oversimplify. And most answers are pretty simple, but they're not that simple. They require a little bit more detail. They require a little bit more research, asking a lot more questions, and asking the right questions to understand truly what the mission is.
Right. That's so good. I mean, everybody loves predictions. That's why people tune in, is to see who predicts and gets it right. Should we be strapping up, putting the seatbelt on for a bumpy next couple of years? Or are we good and you think normalcy is a little bit more coming and here to stay?
I think the smartest people under all circumstances buy insurance policies. Someone who goes out looking for an insurance policy as they see their roof catching on fire is stupid, is not prudent. So yes, I think we should always be balancing a fine line between being prepared for some difficulty while enjoying life and, living life to the fullest.
Right.
I think everything at the end of the day is about balance and compromise. But I do think taking out insurance policies that may or may not pay off is always wise. Why? Because you sleep well at night. I think as an agent who has savings, when a market becomes more challenged, you stop making decisions that are in your interest because you're desperate for cash, and you keep focusing on that which is the professional mission to take care of your clients' priorities as your priority.
Correct.
And I think the same is true for everything. So is a pandemic coming again? Probably. There's probably something coming. Who would have predicted this? There were people who did predict it.
Yeah.
But for those who were extremely healthy, who were keeping trim, exercising, etc., their chances of survival before a vaccine came out were much, much, much higher.
Yeah.
That's called an insurance policy. So everywhere where you can put in insurance policies and having savings, etc., those are the things that we should always be doing.
So an article just came out saying that for the first time in about 3 or 4 years, the increase in foreign money into real estate in New York City and Lower Fairfield County is at a big increase. Eastern European, Russian money is almost non-existent now, but big China money. What are you seeing? Are you seeing a big foreign money market come in now, mainly as investors?
Having grown up in South Africa and being a foreigner to the country still, even though I've been here for over 35 years, anyone who's ever lived outside of America is more than likely going to want to invest something in America. And I think the old saying is, never bet against America. We may have extraordinary problems and challenges and divisions. This is a phenomenal country. This is a phenomenal country. And if you look at what Greenwich offers and what New York City offers, these are phenomenal environments, the likes of which barely exist anywhere else on the planet. And yes, if I lived anywhere else, I'd want to invest in these environments.
Yeah. So smart money and foreign money is looking at the economy and saying it's down, but I think it's now is a good time to buy. Because in New York City, the foreign market that's coming and buying as investments are looking at what these rents are about to be and saying, look, we have a lack of housing and shortage, so this is my time to cash in and make some money on these rents.
Well, I think it's also a problem when you have large institutional investors buying up a lot of affordable housing that takes away from the pool of affordable inventory, that's a real problem.
They said 1 in 10 buyers used to be investors. Now it's 1 in 5. And now we're talking about big investors. We're talking about Blackstone and some big institutional investors buying, residential real estate.
It's damaging.
Yeah.
It is damaging because when you create a culture of renters that are susceptible to rent increases again and again and again, that's when you trigger the potential for government to step in, and then it gets messier. So I do think one should never bet against America because I think it's the most spectacular economy on the planet. And the inventiveness and the tenacity and the work ethic is just astounding. But I think more importantly, even with a weak dollar, at least a very strong dollar, which we have right now, even under that circumstance, people will find investing in America attractive because maybe there are more opportunities right now. One thing that is troubling, though, is that when you have these exacerbated rents, some people might be sending the wrong message that those super high rents are forever. So I would caution everyone to look at their rent rolls right now that are maybe at extreme levels and give them a little bit of a discount to have a reality check.
Yes, very good point. Let's shift to Compass. Compass is now a Fortune 500 company, publicly traded. A lot has happened since I joined 2 years ago. Obviously, you're one of the founding members. You are chief evangelist. You do the email every single day, which
praise be.
I am so impressed. I will never understand the level and how you're able to come up with content all the time. Don't give away your secrets. Just tune in and get on his newsletter if you can. But the future of real estate seems to be going in the technology world. It seems to be going in this way. Let's talk a little bit about Compass in the future. What do you see them how, and you must be so proud.
I'm extremely proud of what Compass has accomplished, but I think the greatest achievement of Compass to me is the fact that we've had to sacrifice on profitability to invest in an infrastructure for the future. And I think a lot of people don't fully understand that, but I think really smart people get it. The investment to get the technology right is enormous. That plus opening up 500 plus offices over a very short period of time requires an enormous investment in long-term thinking. Short-term benefits are few and far between. And yes, last year was the spectacular year. This year, probably not as great, who knows? But I think the investment in technology is something that every prudent company is doing in every industry. And real estate had fallen very much behind in that regard, mostly outsourcing bits and pieces and gluing them together with a glue gun. And I used to be in fashion, and when you glue a dress together, it falls apart sooner or later. So I know about glue guns. I think when you build a very solid foundation and then an infrastructure that is built to last, you have the ability to provide an ecosystem to the professional entrepreneurs like yourself to make their businesses soar. And we are seeing that around the country, that when an agent embraces the technology and the systems and the tools and the support, their careers soar. So when you can provide an ecosystem that allows entrepreneurship at its very best, the small American business dream and not so small business American dream to soar, that's, I think, when you've built something really magical that can only improve over time.
What is one of the best Compass tools that you use or will be using that you're excited that's coming up, that you say every agent should use, this is a staple of my business?
The staple of my business is collections, because collections is the ultimate marriage of what I think Compass is all about. And that is high tech and high touch. A lot of our critics have wanted us to be one or the other. Oh, they're a traditional broker. Oh, they're a tech company. Oh, they're traditional. Oh, get over it. You can be both. And if you look at a company like Amazon even, who has high tech, but they have high touch as well. Now, granted, if you call Amazon, no one's going to pick up the phone. In real estate land at Compass, you have the high tech and someone picks up the phone. But for me, collections, the Pinterest board of real estate, is the ultimate tool in technology fueling efficiency and allowing you as an agent to install the insights that are non-Googleable. And that to me is the perfect poster child for the Compass philosophy, high tech and high touch. And when you put the two together, you have marketing magic. Not only marketing, advisory magic. Because when you're providing real non-Googleable insights to the consumer, they see real value.
As real estate, they've been talking about this. I got into the business. All real estate agents are going to become travel agents, and we're going to be out of the business. And I've seen the opposite. Real estate agents become more valuable than ever. And as much as third-party sites try to push people and agents out of the way, companies like Compass step in with the technology, and we push our value even higher and higher and higher. Where do you see the future of real estate and real estate agents and agencies going?
Well, I think there's one key word that you need to install in that: professional real estate agents.
Yeah.
I think there was a moment in time where being a hobby agent or a luck agent was sufficient to get by, but going forward it'll be the professional agent that'll do incredibly well. Because whenever the consumer sees real value, they're willing to pay for it. If they don't see real value, if I don't see real value in anything, I don't want to pay for it. And I think that is the big differentiator. So I've always said that the relationships and the value of a Compass agent start months and years before a transaction, continue all the way through a transaction, and then exist forever afterwards. And if you're only paying for the services at the time of a transaction, you're getting a bargain.
For new real estate agents even looking to get into the business that maybe don't have the expertise, and if they were going to take a piece of information from this, it's become super knowledgeable in your market and be able to bring that value to people in a professional manner.
And also, I think what's very critical is I don't think agents message sufficiently the extent of the work we do in what we do. It always looks oversimplified because you have these trashy TV shows that show someone throwing a drink and signing a contract and then going, on a jet to Paris because they earned $200,000.
Right.
If it were that easy, everyone would be doing it. I think we have a responsibility to the consumer to educate them to the complexities and the fine, subtle nuances of real estate that not only can deliver great value to them, but also can make the whole process quite enjoyable.
I think people get, as real estate agents, I think the number one question people start to have is, well, I feel like I can give them a lot of information. I feel like I can almost drown them in statistics and show my market knowledge. But at the end of the day, I feel like all they care about is wanting to be entertained. What captures their attention,
I think the best kind of information is infotainment, where the information keeps your audience engaged. Because if it's too much information, you aren't editing, and that's what they pay us for. If we had to give them all the information and left them to edit, why do they need us? It's pointless. So the key is to extrapolate the data, information, and insights that are specifically relevant to the client in front of us. That's where you bring real value to the table.
Yeah.
And that requires skill and practice or brilliance. Sometimes people step into this and they get it in 2 seconds and they, multiply learning dramatically. But there is a lot to learn. And I think we as agents have a responsibility to the consumer to educate them to the value we bring with all of what we do. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
And that's why I go back to everything. Nothing is simple. The other day I was watching this TV show about a cruise ship. I didn't realize what it takes to feed 6,000 people on a boat.
Yeah.
When you understand the complexities of all industries, you understand the pricing. And the same is true for brokerage.
And you have a respect for what they do. But
Yes.
if we don't ever show that, then it just makes it seem like, oh, anybody can do this.
And we aren't just transactional facilitators. That's the biggest misnomer out there, that we're just going in, we'll put a yard sign up and we'll get to the closing and we'll clean the window before the open house. That's not what we do. Right. That's just a small sliver of what we do.
Right. It's like when you go in, do you care more about your house's worth or pricing or how we sell properties? It's like all those two questions. That's really what it is.
And selling the property or helping buy the property is just one aspect of it. It's everything that happens before, and then what happens afterwards? Do you just leave them to rot?
Right.
No, I'm in touch with my clients all the time. I don't call them out, do you want to buy, do you want to sell? If they want to buy, want to sell, they'll call me. but I'm in touch with them to see if I can help them. They reach out to me with anything and everything related to real estate. And in that lies a long-term value that becomes cheap when you're only paying for the transaction.
That's true. That's a lot of expertise and value just to have on a cell phone or on a database that you can just tap into.
Imagine if you could call the guy who runs your hedge fund every 3 years to get good advice.
Yeah.
No, you pay him every year.
Yeah.
He gets a percentage every year.
And on the transactions too.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leonard, for being here with us.
Thank you very
and
much.
talking to us. And anybody out there who's interested in learning a little bit more about Leonard, following Leonard, we'll leave all of his information on the bottom here in the description. And same with me, if you're ever looking for any real estate in Connecticut, in Greenwich, Connecticut, and in New York City, this is the best of the best. Please reach out to us. And everybody, till next time, take care.